Hello and welcome to my tutorial how to create art with free tools. In part 3 of the tutorial we will look into the software Houdini and create some procedural modeling tools from scratch, which we will then use to create a deer and its antlers. We will also look into automatic UV layouts, texture baking, and applying these textures to get closer to the concept that we want. We will use pathfinding techniques to come up with a driftwood version of that same deer and look deeper into automatic UV unwrapping to better suit our needs. We will also discover some Boolean techniques to come up with a cave and create some holes to let some light in. Okay, let's jump right in. If you Google Houdini Apprentice, it will bring you to the Houdini website where you can download the free Houdini Apprentice version for studying Houdini. Once you have downloaded the installer, just run it, choose your settings, and this will install Houdini for you. So you need to reboot your PC, and once you start Houdini, go to General User Interface and adjust the global UI scale to 1.5. This will require a restart, so meanwhile we can look at what we want to do. So there's this feature in ZBrush called Z-Spheres, and that's something that I want to recreate as a procedural tool for the modeling that we're going to do later on. So with the little arrow icons you can adjust your viewport, and I'm just pulling the geometry spreadsheet to the bottom of my screen here, and I will save this as my workspace. In the Tools section in the Node Graph Editor I will enable the grid lines, and then I start creating a geometry. I call it C-spheres instead of Z-spheres. So we start by the add operator, and we just add a point at the location 0, 0, 0. So when I'm enabling the point indice button, I can see point 0 now. Then I'm adding a next add operator, and I set the point location to 1, 2, and 3 in 3D space. So now we can already see these two are connected by a line, because I checked the polygons by group tab as well. Next I want to create a circle. It needs to be a polygon circle. And I want to update the viewport to front as well to see the resolution and change the divisions to 16. We can already see the geometry spreadsheet being populated with point data now. And now I want to use the copy to point operator, and on the left side I plug in the circle. On the right side I plug in the points that we created, and this will basically connect the circle to the point, so whenever I move a point, the whole circle moves with that point. With the skin operator, I'm now basically creating a tube shape that connects both of these circles, and this is already the first part of our tool that we want to need. I'm just renaming that, judging by the point numbers, so I also want to be consistent in naming the points equally to the sphere that I'm creating now, so we have less confusion later on. So sphere 0, I just convert it to a polygon mesh, or to a polygon, and the center of the sphere, I want it to be at the position of that point. So what I can do is I can reference that point position. Or I can even do it the other way around by referencing the sphere position to the point. So whenever I move the sphere, the point will move with the sphere as well. So that works. I'm alt dragging the sphere operator to create a copy. And this time I copy the new sphere parameter. So instead of linking it to sphere 0, I link it to sphere 1. So now when I move the other sphere, the point moves right with it. And now, since the circles are connected or copied to the point, they also move with the sphere. However, the alignment doesn't work really well. As you can see that the tube is somehow not really encompassing the sphere. It's because it's not looking at the sphere in the right angle. So what I do need is normals on the points, so the circles are automatically aligned to the normals. So I'm creating an attribute wrangle, and for point 0, so I set the group to 0 because I want it to run over points. Then I write v at n equals v at p, and then I can see the point position, the sphere position, and I just reference that. So v at p minus point, and if I pull up the help on the point operator, I can see it wants the geometry, the attribute class, and the name. So in brackets after point, I'm referencing the geometry first, and 0 is referencing to the input that comes into the node. So incoming from the point, I want the position, the attribute class position. And now the last piece that is missing is attribute 1, because I want the first entry on that to calculate the distance between both of these points. So between point 0 and point 1. And that gives me the normal already. As you can see, the normal is now displayed in the viewport as an extension of that spline. So I copied the whole thing and I just changed the group to 1. So the attribute wrangle now just needs to change positions in the terms on how I calculate it. So this time I'm calculating from one point to the current position. And it's basically the exact same normal that the other point has. So we could have even reused the other normal and applied it to both points. But this way it's technically more clean. So now I'm connecting the inputs from the copy to point inputs to the attribute wrangle, and we can see the difference. And because the circle is now aligned to the normal, and that way it kind of looks towards the other circle before creating the tube. Alright, that works. So now when I move the spheres, obviously the sphere moves, but the tube connecting the spheres also moves with it. If I press enter in the viewport, I can get the handle for the sphere. But what doesn't work yet is the scale. So I want the tube to scale together with the sphere. So I copy the parameter, and I'm creating a new attribute. F at p scale equals, and I paste the relative reference of that sphere scale into here. And I close the command with the semicolon. So now I see a new attribute in my geometry spreadsheet, the p scale. So I also want to apply that to the other attribute wrangle. So both of these get that. Okay, that seems to work. So now scaling the sphere also scales the point attribute p scale, and when the circle is copied to the point, that actually scales the sphere as well. So let me save that out. I am saving that with the HIP extension. If you are using the non-commercial Apprentice version of Houdini, your extension will be HIP NC instead, but you will have the exact same functionality. So now I want to turn all of this into a Houdini digital asset. So first I bring all of that into a subnet by clicking create the subnet button, and then I call the subnet C-spheres. And then under assets, I click new digital asset, I give it an operator name and save it into an HDA folder on my disk. This opens up the operator type properties window, and I'm just adjusting the maximum inputs and outputs to 1. So now this HDA lives on my disk, and I can just load another instance of it and connect both of these. It's the same Houdini digital asset, but I'm plugging the output from the first one into the second one. I'm going to the type properties because I want to bring and expose some of these properties to the top of the Houdini digital asset for the user to use. So I'm just clicking on the sphere and I'm dragging over the center and the scale buttons into the type properties window. And then I'm renaming them accordingly to the numbering that we gave it earlier, which is 0 and 1. So the user will easily know which is which. Okay, the parameters are exposed now on the digital asset, and these change individually between both of the Houdini digital assets, although they are being read from the same file on disk. And I'm basically just driving the parameters in the digital asset from the top level now. So I can match the current definition and save the node type, and I'm saving it first and matching the current definition, and on the lower ones I select allow editing of contents. So I can take the input from the previous C-sphere, and I'm just creating a null here so I don't get confused later on, but whatever is coming from that input is just coming from the first digital asset that we have in our node stream, because I want to match up each individual links with the previous one. So as a first step, I want to merge the current created geometry with the one that came in from the previous one. So I'm using the merge node to do that, and I can see first there's only one tube, and then this one tube is merged with the second tube, and they are being displayed together now. So that seems to work perfect. But then I'm not seeing the spheres, and I don't see how they are connected. So I'm just dragging them into the merge node as well. So I'm saving the HDA, which also updates the HDA up in the stream, so both of them get updated and show the tube and the spheres now. However, their position is not connected to each other, so the lower asset doesn't read from the upper one. So I'm editing the upper one, which is all the same. You can see it being updated now. And I create a new attribute wrangle where I want to save the position of point 1 into the details tab of the geometry spreadsheet. So I run over detail, and I want to create a new vector, add previous position, so v add prev pos equals, and then I'm just looking up the position of the point 1. I already have it here, so I can just read from that. And it happens to be the exact same thing as the center of the sphere. But the center of the sphere itself has a lot of points, and the points have positions that do not match the center of the sphere. So I need to drag the input from the sphere directly into the attribute wrangle. So after copying and pasting relative attributes, I can now access the X part of the sphere center, but I want the whole vector. So I'm starting curly brackets and separating the same command with commas, and I just change the TX, TY and TZ part of that. I'm closing the curly bracket again and adding a semicolon. And this should add the detail attribute with the position of the center of the sphere to this attribute wrangle. I also want to get the scale, so again I copy the parameter and I paste as relative reference, but it deletes all my text that I have previously wrote. So this is a small bug that I'm encountering on my system. So what I do instead, I just create a new wrangle, I paste the relative reference there, and then I'm copying the text back to the previous wrangle. So this is just a workaround because the pasting behaved a little bit weird. So now I'm referencing the scale and the position of the center of the sphere. And both of these are now found in the Detail tab of that attribute wrangle. And I'm connecting this to the output. So this detail information is being passed into the other HDA as well. So I'm editing this now. We could continue to work in the same HDA. I'm just going to the lower one so I can see the values I'm working with. And they actually appear now in the input of the previous C-sphere. So I can start reading that. I'm using the blast node first to get rid of all the geometry that is coming into the network, and this just keeps the detail attributes. So the geometry is gone, but the detail attributes and information is still there. I'm creating another add node. And this, I want this to be my point 0 from the previous input. And then for the position of point 0, I want to access the detail attribute. Opening the brackets, hitting F1 for help, and then I need to reference the surface node, the attribute name, and the attribute index. The surface node is 0, which is the input 0, which is coming from the previous node. The attribute name is prevpos, and I want index 0, which equals x. And then I paste that, I change the last 0 to 1, and I paste it again, change it to 2, so it reads index 0, 1, and 2, which equals x, y, and z. So as you can see, the point is already reading it, and now I just want to bring in the scale as well, the p-scale. So f at p-scale equals detail brackets 0, comma, parentheses, p-scale 0, semicolon. So now I have a point in my node network that has the position and the p-scale value of the point that the previous point 1 had in the previous HDA. But now this is point 0 in my case. But I also want to add point 1 now, the new destination. And this one I just alt dragged over from the previous node that we had. So this is basically just a copy. I did not change the functionality here. So that already works. I can see on the one part of the node network it's referencing the previous point 0 position. And then the other part of the network, it's referencing whatever is being set up. But now I need to choose which network path to take. Do I want to read from the previous HDA, or do I want to define my own? So I need to add a switch, and I want to switch over to the left part of the network if data is coming in. So I'm just reading the number of points that are coming in. Open the brackets, 0, 0, slash, and I'm referencing the null that enters my network. So I just put the name of the null. Input pref csphere. And if the number of points on that null is lower than 1, so if no points are coming in, then this switch flips to true, to 1. So we can verify that. In this network, the amount of points that are coming in is 0, so the switch flips to position 1 and it reads from the right part of the network now. Because in here there's no incoming points, so the input is 1, or the selection of the switch is 1, and you can see the dotted line and the solid line is reading from the right part of the network. Okay, going back to the lower, to the next digital asset, I can see there's still a bug with the sphere missing and the cylinder not being oriented properly. And this is again because I don't have proper normals yet. There's only one normal, and point 0 is missing its normal. So I'm just going to the attribute wrangle that we had before. I'm alt dragging it over and just plugging it into the right part of the network as well. Okay, that works. Alright, we have like a functional 2-part C-sphere with connected tubes. So it works just as expected. However, there's still this other sphere floating around, sphere 0. And since we already have a sphere 0 coming in from the previous digital asset, I don't really need to create a new one. It's just floating and it's not necessary. So I'm copying the whole switch again. I'll call it previous or no previous switch. Hitting the Y key opens the scissors tool, and I can cut the lines between nodes that way. And now I want to do the same thing for the spheres. So if there already is an input, then I don't want sphere 0 to be used. So I either merge 0 and 1, or only use 1. Depending on if there's input coming into this HDA. So currently it only uses sphere 1 and it ignores sphere 0 because the switch detected points coming into the network. That means we already have a sphere 0 in this network. And then I'm merging the spheres back into the system. Alright, so the floating sphere is gone. That works. Perfect. Okay, so testing the scale, I can see something is not hooked up properly yet. So I'm reading the P scale from the previous part of the network. But then I'm overwriting that with the scale from sphere 0. And I don't want that. So I put 2 slashes to comment that line away. I comment out this line from the attribute wrangle. So now the scale is not overwritten anymore when there's input incoming. Alright, this works pretty well already. I cannot find any more bugs with that system. There's a slight mismatch with the geometry, but that will be totally fine because we will remesh all that geometry later anyway. So I'm just starting to clean up the network a little bit. Make it easier to understand. And giving everything a proper name. So this is merging the tube with the spheres. And this is merging the previous spheres with the tube. Then I'm using the network boxes to give everything some proper naming. So this is the part of the network where we only have the origin spheres going on, and that is only executed when there's no input to this digital asset. I'm doing the same thing for this part of the network. So this is sphere from input, because we're reading the sphere location and geometry from the input that is coming in from the previous HDA. Making a little bit more room to clean that up. So this just helps me a lot to, when I come back to this file, let's say in a month or two, to really figure out what's going on here way faster. If I don't do that, sometimes I cannot make sense of what has happened before. I'm also coloring these nodes green. This is just for me to tell myself that these nodes are actually referenced from the digital asset directly. So if I go to the type properties now, I can go to the interactive tab, and I want to create handles for the spheres. So I'm selecting sphere 1 here, right click, export handle to digital asset, and you will see it automatically populates that part of the type properties. So there's a lot of information I don't need. I'm just getting rid of that. I'm mostly interested in the center, so I can move the sphere around. It created some additional parameters that I don't need to be exposed, so I delete that. And now I can actually pull the handles on that asset, which makes it much easier to use. Okay, let's do a Google search on deer anatomy and find a good reference for our viewport. So we'll save that out, and in Houdini, go to the viewport, switch it to right, open the options, go to background, and navigate for the image that you just saved. Check for display background image, and let's check the height of a usual deer. Yeah, so it's roughly around 2 meters. So I'm disabling auto place image and make sure that the feet of the deer are aligned with the origin of the viewport and that the height of the deer is between 1 and 2 meters. And then I'm using the C-sphere digital asset that we just made. And I'm adjusting its values to get a little bit closer to the background image I'm using. Switching the viewport to wireframe and just positioning the points roughly where I want them to be and scaling them into the right size. And I'm already realizing that the default values that this tool is using are not really set up in a really good way, because it was like all over the viewport and the different scales. So I'm going to the type properties, and in channels for center 0 I set everything to 0, and for center 1 I set it to something different than 0 but closer to the origin at least. So 1, 1, 0 would make sense based on the coordinate system that I'm seeing in the viewport. It actually makes more sense to set it to x0. And then there's a slider for the range, and I'm setting this from 0.01 to 1 on the scale. And again, for this one I also changed the default values. Okay, so when I'm creating the next digital asset instance, it already starts with better default values now. Makes it much easier to drag it around and start repositioning the joints of the deer. And I'm roughly trying to place this at the joints of the skeleton. And then I'm just creating the next digital asset. And I can see I want to adjust the default values even smaller. So I'm just going and optimizing the tool's default values with some user experience. While I'm using the tool, I'm learning more and more what good default values would be for the tool, and I'm just keeping and adjusting it. And every time I redo that, I create a new tool, the default values get better. Yeah, one more to finish the first leg. Again, I'm increasing the usability of the tool while I'm testing it, making sure everything works quite nicely out of the box. I just need to adjust the scale a little bit. And since they are all connected, I can just create the other leg by extending from the pivot of the deer again. But I see I put the pivot maybe in the wrong place here. So I'm actually disconnecting that. And bringing it to the shoulder bone next to the rib cage. And then I follow this branch like I did before. This is just rinse and repeat now. Creating a new digital asset, aligning it with the joints, scaling it properly, and moving on to the next part of the leg. I'm realizing that I can actually copy the existing leg and just reuse what I have done already. So I'll do that now. I'll alt drag it over and just connect it. I'm seeing there's one too many, so I'm deleting this and then just dragging it sideways. This makes it much faster. So I want to get this little tailbone covered as well. And I'm not sticking too closely to the actual joint position, but I'm also taking the skin and the outer mesh, the outer geometry of the whole deer into consideration. So now the only thing that's missing is the neck and the head. And it's so much easier now that the handles are also set up properly, so I can choose to adjust the scale and the position either on the exposed values directly, or go to the viewport and drag the handle around to a position where I like it. So yes, it took some time to create the tool, but now it saves me so much time on the modeling side, because I just need to connect one digital asset to the next, and within a couple of minutes I basically can create the whole basic structure of that deer. And it's super reusable, so the next time I want to model something similar, I can just use this tool and build on it. So this is just a very basic version, obviously, but with every use I try to improve the tools that I make as well, and they get better and better, and I end up with a very mighty toolbox that lets me create very complex scenes in a very fast way. So now that I'm done with the branches, I'm merging all of that together, and I made some mistakes. Some of the stuff is obviously offset by 5 meters on X. So I'm selecting all the HDAs and putting the center to center 1, X to 0. And for the legs, I just pull all of them out sideways a little bit as well. So I'm not a professional organic modeler, obviously. But this is not what this exercise is about. You will see once we remesh all of that and treat it procedurally, the anatomy and the proper way of organic modeling will not play a big role in this project. So here I'm just fine-tuning now. I see that I made some mistakes in setting up the bones, so I'm trying to fix that here. And since it's procedural, it's super easy to go back and forth between the states that I had and just go to the beginning of the whole network and try to fix things afterwards. Alright, so after merging, I'm adding the mirror node. And I create a VDB from polygons now. So this turns the whole thing into a volume basically. And I'm adjusting the voxel size here to get the thickness and density that I want. And then I use the next node convert VDB, and I'm converting it back to polygons. And I'm adjusting the ISO value to something that just makes sense in the viewport. So I don't have fixed values, I usually just reference what I see in the viewport here. Yeah, I feel like the whole deer is a bit fat, so I'm adding a transform node and scaling the x-axis to 0.8. And now I can go back and forth to the beginning of the network and still adjust some of the shapes, and you see the whole remeshed or converted polygon mesh adjusts accordingly nearly in real time. So it's very easy to use and continue sculpting on it. Just trying to make a little bit of polishing on that before we move on, so it's not like a super basic version. So I also want to create the antlers, and I'm just trying to use a different tool for that. So I'm putting down a curve and trace the branches of the antlers. using another curve to trace the secondary branches. And last one. I want to merge all of that together. And I'm using the point display mode now to see what I have done. Just double checking that everything is in its right place. And now I want to create a for each primitive loop. So this is basically processing all the curves and applies the same action to every curve. And I want to resample these curves now, each individually, to a length of 0.2. So this basically removes and adds points, so the curve is resampled to have a point every 0.2 meters. I'm just making sure all the curves have the same resolution. I'm then using a sort node and I'm inverting the point numbers. And with an attribute wrangle, I set f at pscale equals at ptnum plus 1. So I can see that now showing up in my geometry spreadsheet as well. And what I'm doing here is I'm making the p-scale of the points grow bigger. I'm making them smaller the further they are apart from the head. After the end of the for each, I'm adding a polywire. And I'm changing the wire radius to be at p-scale. And that's way too huge, so I'm multiplying by 0.005. And now I'm already getting something that looks close to antlers. I'm adjusting the scale values a little bit, just judging by the viewport. And then I'm starting to tweak the curves again at the top of my network to also have some direction in the 3D space and to properly connect to the main branch. So we could have done something very similar with the tool that we created just now. And I just want to try and show how you can also do something similar with a more simple tool. So you don't always need to go super crazy on the digital asset part if you just need to create a small amount of geometry that doesn't need to be super sophisticated. I'm mirroring this over. This already highlights some issues to me, so I'm going back to the curves and trying to not have the points merging together in the center of the axis at 0. Okay. This starts to look like antlers now. Again, I'm trying to remesh it, so I'm using VDB from polygons. I'm adjusting the voxel size. This is the very same workflow that we used before for the body of the deer. And I'm converting it back to polygons. And the whole thing is a little bit square-ish. So I'll want to fix that as well. Going back to the polywire and changing the divisions to something that makes more sense. 10. And I'm just going back and forth between the nodes until I get something that looks convincing to me. And I find that the scale didn't really work for me, so I'm going back to the attribute wrangle and trying out different things here until I'm more happy with the result. Yeah, 0.5 seems to do the trick. So with the polyreduce node, I'm bringing down the number of polygons. This looks convincing. Then I'm using the subdivide node to bring it back up. And this starts to blend the branches much better with the main branch. So the secondary branches, they kind of now melt into the main branch of the antlers. So we have two network paths now. One is the body for the deer, and I just want to put that into network boxes. And the other one is the antlers that we just made. Okay, we can use the merge node to bring both of them together. And I can see it doesn't really connect very well to the head itself. It's also too big on the scaling, so I'm trying to bring both into relation. It's also floating above the head somehow, but it's super easy to go back to the initial curves and now just bring it down to where it should be. And it's quite amazing how all the mesh conversions update in real time now. So I can really use that to make some artistic choices now and exaggerate things that I would like to exaggerate. This starts to look quite okay. We can always come back later and tweak it more once we see how it will look in the final image. But for now this is good enough. So let's save that. I would like to install the game tools now. So I'm going to the shelf and adding the game tools shelf set. And if I'm going to the Side Effects Labs toolbar, I can update that tool set. This will require a restart of Houdini, but afterwards, going to the shelf set game tools, under the tab Side Effects Labs, I can see it being populated with tools. This can be useful to automatically create UVs, but I'm going to show you a workflow that will use the traditional nodes that we have. So I'm laying down the UV unwrap and the UV layout node and the UV quickshade node. And without going into the settings, I'm already getting a good version of unwrapped UVs for the deer. I can change the viewport to UV view, and I can see how the islands of the UVs are already laid out properly. The same thing can be achieved with the auto UV operator from the game tool shelf, which has a very similar function in one node only. So now I want to create a grid, and I'm changing my view to the top viewport, and I want to create an attribute noise on that grid. And the attribute I want to have noise on is P for position. And I'm changing the grid to triangles, and then I'm going to adjust the amplitude of the noise, and I'm pasting relative references to the X value of the noise. So X, Y, and Z always stay the same. I'm using the facet node to change the normal of the triangles, and I'm setting the value to 1. And with the simple baker node from the game tool shelf, I'm just baking out the normal map only. So this already worked. That's perfect. And maybe later on I want to use a black and white map for that, but we will deal with that later. Cleaning up the node network. And now I'm picking the texture that I just rendered and I'm applying it to the deer. But as you can see, the mesh of the deer is done in such a way that I get a lot of harsh seams that I would like to fix. So I'm using the remesh node again after merging the geometry of the deer. And I'm changing the edge length to adaptive. And then I'm tweaking the relative density to something lower. And then I'm using the poly reduce node again to further decrease the geometry resolution on the deer. Okay, this looks better now. I'm using the facet node again. So now plugging in the same texture already looks very close to what I wanted. Alright, pretty close. Next I want to do the driftwood version of the deer. So I'm pushing this aside and I'm branching off from the convert to VDB node and copying over the remesh, poly reduce and facet nodes. And I'm starting from there to lay down the VDB from polygons node. And this time I want to create a fog VDB with a voxel size of 0.05. I'm tweaking this value to make sure the fog resembles the deer and the inner parts of the deer more. And when I plug a scatter node into that, I'm now getting like a point cloud of that deer body that also has points like inside the deer. I'm creating another scatter node on the geometry only, not on the volume, to also create a point cloud on the outer parts of the deer. I'm using a null here just to remind myself on what I'm working on. And then for both of these point clouds I'm just merging them together, and I'm using the tetrahedralized node. And I'm changing the settings to convex hull and connected polylines. And for the reference object, the second input of that node, I'm pushing in the polygon version of that deer. And then using a measure node to measure the perimeter. I can already see in my geometry spreadsheet how the length of each of the lines is being calculated and displayed. And I'm using the delete node to delete by expression. And I'm typing $perimeter is smaller than 0.5. And then I delete non-selected. So this just deletes all the edges, the curves that are longer than a certain value. And with that I'm creating a mesh that is also filled on the inside of the deer. Then I'm starting to create a group and I call it start. It's a point group type. And I'm adjusting the bounding box to select the feet of the deer. I'm then duplicating that, call it end, and adjust this end group to be somewhere within the torso in the center of the deer. And this selects all the points that are within that bounding box. And with the find shortest path node, I can then use start points start group and end points end group and change the output paths from any start to any end. And this basically traces paths through this point cloud and creates good basis for the driftwood shapes that I'm looking for. So I'm repeating this whole process. I'm duplicating the start and end group and path find, and I'm just adjusting the bounding volume locations for the groups, and thereby creating new lines where I want my driftwood to grow on later. I'm just playing around with the values until I get what I'm looking for, and then going back to the bounding boxes to capture more or less points depending on the density that I'm looking for. Okay, I'm duplicating these 3 nodes again. I'm calling it ribs to head now, and I'm adjusting the start group and the end group accordingly. So now I'm capturing the neck and the face and the head as well. Okay, all of this can be merged together now. And I can already see that I'm missing a little bit on the top of the deer. So I'm going back to adjust the groups to cover all the areas that I want to encompass with the pathfind. If 3 is not enough in your case, feel free to just create another set of pathfinding to cover all your object, all the extents of your object with these lines. So referencing the concept, I can see that I'm getting closer now. So I'm using the fuse node and adjust the snap distance to get rid of overlapping lines. And then I'm converting everything to a NURBS curve to get rid of that low poly triangle look. And I'm using the convert node again to convert it back to polygons. I can then use the polywire node to create geometry around each line, and I'm adjusting the divisions and the wire radius to something that gets closer to what I'm looking for. Alright, for a basic version this already looks really good. I'm using the clean node and output some better geometry before bringing all that into Unreal and before unwrapping it as well. I'm also using a smooth node on the P attribute just to clean up the pathfind a little bit more. Using the VDB from polygons, reusing the same workflow that we had before. So adjusting the voxel size, and then converting the VDB back to polygons. And then I can use the remesh node to clean that up one more time. Adjusting the relative density and the gradation to something that looks convincing to me in the viewport. Using the poly reduce just to lower the poly count. I don't need that super high resolution. And then just adding a box around it and give it a good name. And we can always come back later to improve the look of this, but this is a very good start. Now I'm branching off the subdivide node of the antler mesh, and I'm just creating nulls to bring that data down. And then I'm merging the antlers with the driftwood deer. Alright, that works. And then I'm copying the UV layout nodes that I laid out before and just plug in the whole driftwood deer into the UV quick shade. So this data is ready to go into the output node now. Next I want to work on that rainbow tube. So I'm naming my geometry first before I jump into the rainbow tube. And then I want to start with a simple line. I change the origin to be -0.5. And I want the direction to be 1 on the z-axis. So this gives me like a line that looks like sideways. I'm then creating a circle. And I just roughly want to reference the deer. And I'm changing the radius of the circle to somehow match and encompass the deer. So I'm just using that as a size reference for now. So I want to change the primitive type to polygon. So this becomes a polygon circle. And I want to change the divisions as well to 64, so I have more resolution. And I want this to be an open arc. The reason is, if it's an open arc, I can easily adjust the UVs later on. So with an attribute wrangle, I want to start with an if statement. So if, open brackets, v at p.y is smaller than 0, then I'm using the curly brackets to define the then, v at p.y equals 0. So everything that is below 0 in height is now snapped to 0. So I don't have like a rainbow tube that is like below the ground or underwater. I want it to be flat at the bottom. And I'm using the copy to points operator, and I'm plugging in the line on the left and the circle on the right, and that copies the line to each point on that curve. And using the skin operator and columns connectivity now already gives me something that looks much closer to the tube that I want. So I'm using the UV texture operator and the texture type arc length spline. I'm adjusting my viewport to show me the UV view as well, and I can see all the points are like at the bottom in UV space. And they also overlap, so I want to fix that first. So again, I'm using an attribute wrangle. I'm typing at uv.y equals, and I want to show you the primitive numbers. So both of these curves are primitives, 0 and 1. So I want to reference both of that and separate it. So add prim num multiplied by bracket open 1 divided by float bracket open add number of prims minus 1 close bracket semicolon. So this is a trick I learned from simonschreibt.de. Thanks for that. So I'm just using this in this tutorial. I did not come up with that myself. And this separates both primitives in the UV space. So as you can see, the primitive 0 was at the bottom and primitive 1 was at the top. But still the points are not stretched out to where I want the points to be. They are all in the same location. So I'm using the skin operator. I realize I forgot to change the attribute class on the UV texture node. So I'm changing the attribute class from vertex to point. So this attribute wrangle is just to separate the UV lines based on primitives. And this skin operator now just connects the whole geometry to create like a tube-like mesh. So I can use the measure node to again measure the perimeter of the whole curve of the whole map. And then I'm laying out a UV transform. And I basically want to scale the UVs based on the perimeter of that mesh. In the geometry spreadsheet, I can already see that this is 108 meters long. So I want to scale the UVs by that value. So I'm typing prim to access the primitive attribute, opening the parentheses, and then I'm referencing the name of the measure node, which in my case is a read parameter, comma, 0, and I want to access the parameter attribute, comma 0. So this reads the 108 from the measure node and scales my UVs by the factor of 108. And this is to make sure that the UVs are like properly laid out in a square fashion. So you can see that it's like not stretched or squished. It's just matching perfectly. I can use the polyfill, and I'm grabbing it directly at the circle that basically fills the circle with a plane. And then I'm using UV project and UV quick shade to see how the UVs will look on that area. And the scale of the UV projection doesn't match the extent of my circle. So I'm just putting both of them to 54. So I get square, unsquished UVs. But I can actually copy the parameter of the circle itself and paste as a relative reference. And then multiply by 2. So now it will always follow the real size of the circle. Then I'm merging both of these network paths, and I'll call it circle and plane. And then I want to output both of that for now, and calling it rainbow tube. Alright, so I can see the plane and the tube. Both of them are procedurally UV'd, and if I decide to change the shape later, all of this will stay nicely unwrapped. And calling this geometry rainbow tube. So now I want to create a real tube, and this is just to give me some idea of the shape of the surrounding cave. I'm changing the translation and the rotation of the deers, and I'm duplicating the deer's geometry node to have a second deer so they can face each other. And on the one node I want the abstract deer to be shown. Okay, now I can go back into the tube operator. I'm changing it to polygon and orientation z-axis. And I'm adjusting the radius to be 1 and 1. And actually I want to scale the radius to 6 first. But I can see how my cave is like wider than tall. And I just realized that these output nodes get in my way now. So I'm just cleaning away the unnecessary parts of that network path. So I have a deer abstract and a deer driftwood. And then I'm just deleting the unnecessary parts from the driftwood version. And I want to colorize that, so I'm using the color node and just change it to yellow for now. We will later apply a proper material. Okay, I can continue on the tube now. I'm changing the height to 200, which gives me a really long tube. And I'm scaling it to 20. The radius scale, I'm increasing it to 20 to give some room around the two deers. I'm changing the rows to 8 so I can see the wireframe better, and the column to 16 to make it more smooth. And I'm using a transform node now to rotate on the y-axis to align the cave exit or entrance with the camera better. And then I'm squishing it on the scale Y to 0.4, and I'm using XnView to preview my images, and I'm just setting the interface options to always on top, so this window doesn't keep hiding behind my Houdini window. On the tube node, I'm continuing to adjust the radius scale and the height. I'm just playing around with these values until I find something that I like. I'm copying the attribute wrangle that snapped the circle to 0, and I'm pasting that below the transform node of my new tube. And on the transform node, I'm bringing the translation up by 2 meters, so I get a nice round shape at the edges of that. And this flattens the floor for this cave. Now I'm creating a new tube, and I'm switching it to polygons. So I'm setting down a Boolean node. The first input is the big tube, and the second input is the small tube. And now I'm just adjusting the scale and the size of that tube to intersect with the existing cave. This big cave doesn't have a thickness yet, so I'm adding a poly extrude modifier before the Boolean modifier. And this gives the whole cave, the whole tube, a little bit of thickness. I'm connecting this to the Boolean now, and I can already start to see how the Boolean works by subtracting the small tube. I forgot to set the output back groups on the extrude as well, but now it really works. So whenever I change the secondary tube, it just updates the hole in the cave where I want it to be. So this is a very easy way to cut holes into geometry. And I'm now just trying to translate the secondary tube to match with the lower viewport so I can see it from the camera view. And for this reason I'm actually creating a new camera now that I can lock and set up properly. I just click the camera button on the shelf up there. And I'm positioning this to capture both of the deers and also the exit of that cave. So now I'm just starting to shift all the elements that I have around to make a good composition that is a little bit closer to the concept I'm having at the bottom of my screen. Sometimes in 3D space things don't really work out, especially when you use the warping tools on the photo bashing. In reality, 3D space works differently, so you have to wiggle and cheat a little bit in order to make the camera match the 3D space. That's why it's important to use procedural tools, so it makes it very easy to go back and forth adjusting the secondary tubes. Okay, I'm going to the camera and I'm changing the focal length to 40. I'm just trying to capture a little bit more of the scene. And I'm rotating the secondary tubes to create some nice intersections with the cave. Okay, with all of that done, I'm saving. And this time I'm saving it as a hip.nc file, just to show you guys that it's actually possible to create all of this with the Apprentice version of Houdini. I'm adding a transform node now, and I'm setting the rotate X to 90 and the uniform scale to 100, and this is to prepare for import into Unreal. And then I'm using the file node, and I set the mode to write files, and I just select a name for my geometry, and I'm setting the extension to OBJ. And then Houdini automatically writes that file onto the disk. As you can see, it's already there. So I'm copying both of these nodes, the transform and the file node, and I'm pasting them into the abstract version of the deer as well. Of course, I need to change the file name, and then I connect it to the output, and immediately I see the file popping up in my folder. And again, I'm pasting it to the driftwood deer as well, changing the file name and connecting it up. There it is. Okay, last, same thing for the rainbow tube. Paste, change file name, connect. So we have everything we need now. This concludes the procedural modeling with Houdini part of the tutorial. I hope to see you in part 4, Environments and Lighting with Unreal Engine.